Everyone, welcome to What the Funk podcast. I'm beyond overjoyed to have with me two guys who I've known just for many, many years. We've spent probably far too many times together in too many cities, away from home, on the PHP speaking circuit. Nils Adermann and Jordi Boggiano. You know them better as the people behind Composer and Packagist. So, Nils, Jordi, welcome to What the Funk podcast. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having us.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. PHP had a package manager, right? We had Pickle. No, tell me, I'm just really curious. How did this all start? Did you two of you start it up together? Did you do it independently? We'll get into the ramifications of what you've done in just a moment. But whose idea was all of this?
I think it started out with me showing up at some Symfony conferences just before Symfony 2 was started, interested in switching PHPBB, the forum software that I used to work on, to start using some of the Symfony components, the Symfony framework. And a part of that would have been to build a plugin system for PHPBB. And that's where I first met Jordi. And then Symfony 2, the first beta version, I think, became available in 2011. And Jordi had kind of some early exposure to that. And it became clear that Symfony as a framework, too, needed some mechanism for installing all the different bundles that they came up with as a term. And so that's where we started discussing possible collaboration for building something based on Symfony that could also install the plugins for the forum software. And that eventually led to just building a tool that could just install any PHP package. Ended up helping a lot more people than just our two little projects that we kind of tried working on at the time.
Yeah, and I'm still impressed when I run across a PHP BB. I'm searching for stuff organically on the net, and then I'm like, wait, I know this interface. They're still out there. They're like OS Commerce. They're still up and running, and I guess working. So let me see if I get this right. So this was essentially a it was a tool like so many great inventions, and then maybe companies, a tool of necessity. Maybe there's a little bit of timing there, but so this was kind of an outgrowth of Symfony, and I'm glad because Symfony is on we're on Symfony 7 now, I think, right?
Yes, yeah. It's been a while.
It was interesting to me because I remember, so back in 2011, I was fully heads down in the Magento world, and that was its own, that's PHP, but it was its own kind of silo. And I bring that up only because by the time I came out out of the agency world and actually working for Magento in 2014, I had to start teaching the next version of Magento, which included this thing called Composer. And there had been a little bit of Composer, kind of creeping into the Magento world. But again, it was largely as a tech stack. It was just largely siloed from the forward progress of PHP. And it was interesting to me, this idea of, because I always wondered, well, what if you have a package and it needs another package, but then you have these other things that you want to bring in, leverage the work of others, not only just as it exists today, but as it exists on an ongoing basis. But how do I pull in things that might actually have the same dependencies, but maybe they have, they're on different versions? It seems like a monumental task to try and solve, and I'm sure you as things exist today is not how you built them at the very beginning. Was it a case that as this thing evolved, was that evolution quick? From the thinking of well, we just want to be able to install bundles, and then okay, well now we've actually realized we've stumbled upon how to manage just in general these project dependencies and interdependencies. Was there a lot of going back to the drawing board and starting over, or have you been able to just build things, just perfectly from the beginning? And those of you listening to the podcast, you might hear the chuckles, but there's certainly some smiles.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of the basic design of like, I think it started from the ground up. We needed to support like all dependencies. Like it didn't start as we just want bundles because or just plugins for PHP just because Symfony itself already used like Doctrine and just other libraries that you kind of needed something generic from the get-go. So I think that helped to avoid a lot of maybe common mistake of other like plugin installers that were built throughout the years that were kind of stuck in their little niche. Like we kind of from the get-go opened it up to be just an everything installer and dependencies. Like as soon as you have dependencies, it's also like, yeah, if you have one dependency, two dependencies, 100, it doesn't really matter, right? Like it's you kind of have to solve the problems from the get-go. So I would say that probably helped us avoid a lot of mistakes.
Right.
And then maybe Nils can tell more. Well, yeah.
It's also not like we started from scratch, right? Like it's not like we built the first package manager in existence. Like these things have been around for decades before we even started working on ours.
Yeah.
So it's easy to avoid mistakes if you just have a lot of other people doing the mistakes for you, like years ahead of you.
It's like if you want to start a restaurant, buy an old restaurant. Let someone else do the build out.
Or like maybe just talk to a few people who've already run restaurants before you and like just copy a few things of what they've been doing, right? Instead of being like, all right, I'm the first person to ever invent having a restaurant.
It's not really a mistake until I've made it myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we did a lot of taking inspiration from different package managers, dependency managers, different tooling, and looking at how they're doing things, what's working for them, what's not working for them, and trying to kind of mix this together, and plus add a few specifics to PHP and kind of how people are used to working in PHP. And that's I think the genesis of how Composer then became to be a PHP tool.
Yeah, I mean, and it's ubiquitous. I can't imagine managing any project of really any decent size without relying on trying to do that stuff by hand is going to be fraught. I mean, you're either going to be building a lot of stuff that's already been built before so that you can maintain it yourself, or you're going to just use these now well-known, well-documented conventions and basically rules of engagement that everyone else is probably already operating in. So now eventually you realize that beyond, so there's Composer, and then there's Packagist, and then there's Private Packagist, right? This is the sort of the three things when I'm dreaming about either one of you, these are the three things that are floating around my head. The progression there from Composer into Packagist, and then if I remember correctly, the commercial side of Packagist came later. Is that right, or am I misremembering the story?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So we started Private Packagist late 2016. So kind of 5 years after, or 5.5 years after we started working on Composer as a package manager in earnest. And I think, speaking of mistakes, if anything, it was a mistake to do this that much later.
Yeah.
Like letting the project grow to a point where it needed some kind of financial commercial parts to be able to be maintained in the same way anymore. And in that period of time, people had already found like custom built alternative solutions that they worked on themselves. And now we're like, and one of them is based on an open source private package repository that we built, so Satis namely. And so in a way, starting this business 5 years later, you're now competing with yourself, right? Like you should have just offered this from the beginning, and there would have been so many companies interested in 2012 or 2013. But like now you actually have to convince them that maybe the thing they built themselves is maybe not as great as they thought, and like switching is always a cost.
I'd actually forgotten about Satis. Wow. Yeah, so that's not an uncommon story, though. I know this was, again, my background largely in the Magento world, and it was a great story of from one of the co-founders where they had started, the project had really started to take off and show up in places, and they were going around, they're LA based, going around to some of the conferences there and in the Bay Area, and then showing it to people, and people are like, wow, this is amazing. It's an amazing product. How do you make money? And like, we don't know. We have no idea how we're going to make money with this. And eventually you're going with, finding out a commercial angle. But, here it seems, that was just a little bit of, sprinkling some features on. But, your solution is actually solving. I would say the investment kind of, it pays for itself, doesn't it then? Right? Because doing this work and maintaining this infrastructure to actually, privately, I remember the days when projects were privately hosting their code, but having to again do dependency management on their own. And there was a considerable amount of, cost and opportunity cost of having smart engineers trying to solve this problem that really needed to be solved centrally. The adoption was pretty quick, though, right? Once it was announced.
Private packages, yeah. I think that surprised even us, like how I think within days we had several customers already paying us, and this very quickly went to okay, this is just the right way of handling internal packages. And I think that showed us, or I think that's what I was meant earlier. I think there was an obvious need for this. It was clear to people that like this was going to work well. They jumped right on it, and they would have done the same thing years earlier if you had just like started with it a bit earlier. Nonetheless, like it's worked out great, and it definitely got to the point, and like that's what we set out to do, is where it does financially support us working on the open source infrastructure, working on the open source project. And I think that's important for PHP to know that those tools are maintained by people that actually have their time paid, and you can rely on those getting security fixes in a timely manner. And you can be sure that something like packages.org actually has people looking after the infrastructure that aren't just going to disappear tomorrow because they don't feel like working on it anymore.
It's the blessing and curse, right, of open source. The good thing is the open source software ecosystem is largely devoid of any kind of drama. And moving right along. But this is one of those things that gets balanced and we've seen this from time to time, and it's certainly not limited to PHP. We see this in the JavaScript world, and it can happen from either a person who is a BDFL, dictator for life, or just a critical project for, like, I don't know, padding strings, and someone deciding actively that they don't want to work on it, or realizing, I don't have the time anymore. That's, making sure that there's a sound financial basis. Hell, that's every product company that works, that delivers an open source product. It's a constant struggle. And there are levels and flavors of that debate that I still see to this day. Do you have any thoughts about, PHP itself is, it's run by a foundation. I'm an ambassador. Nils, you're on the board. In our world of by the way, I think open source is one of the most empowering ways to solve the challenges and kind of create space for innovation. But at the end of the day, it is there. Generally, everyone involved in it is there to at least get a salary, if not build a product and build wealth. What do you see happening these days? Like with PHP Foundation is in a pretty good way for the time being in terms of funding, so that its core activities can continue. If PHP, like if the whole management of PHP language went away tomorrow, you would see a pretty sizable disruption, I think, to a lot of projects and by extension a lot of content on the web. What do you see kind of happening these days? Because you've both been in this world for quite some time. Do you think we've evolved this balance of commercialness with what started out as free open source software?
I think it's definitely evolved for sure. I think what's changed over the last years is I think that there's more awareness of the impact the reliance on open source software can have, both on businesses or even public infrastructure. I think it's interesting to see that over the last, let's say, 10 years, it's become an increasing subject in political forums. There's an actual interest on a higher political level in ensuring that infrastructure open source software remains maintained as reliable, as secure, as even people who have nothing to do with software and like we're just in a members of parliaments have heard of open source software, are aware of open source software impacting everyday people's lives in various ways. And I think that similarly you see that in business, where even people on higher levels in businesses that have nothing themselves to do with software are aware of the fact that a lot of the software in their company, this old famous saying about every company is a software company, just some haven't quite understood that yet. There's an understanding now that this is a necessity and that that's something they rely on. Now, getting from that understanding to finding solutions on how to broadly make things sustainable and how to make sure that things keep getting maintained, I think that's something we're going to need a lot more time on, and I think that's something that people are trying to work on, but that we don't really have the right and good answers to yet. I think there's lots of interesting attempts to work on this with I really enjoyed seeing the open source pledge recently. No idea if that's going to make the big difference or not, but it's great to see initiatives like the Sovereign Tech Fund, or now the Sovereign Tech Agency in Germany, where there's actual public funding for infrastructure open source projects. It's interesting to see initiatives like Thanks.dev that try and really spread out money across all of the dependencies to really more support these lower levels of infrastructure instead of like just the key projects that everybody sees and knows. And so I think there's lots and lots of different ways of doing this and lots of people trying things out in this space, but we definitely don't have the answer to how this will work yet, and everybody's still struggling for their own answer.
So you brought up a few different topics there that are all worthy of investigation. Notably recently open source pledge, this is an initiative that allows sort of companies that would benefit from committed levels of funding by organizations, by companies that are using open source. Those companies that are using open source can make there's a prescribed commitment for basically you can donate a certain amount, fixed amount per dev, and make that commitment to do that per year, just to say really say, hey, we're gaining great advantage from open source efforts of others, and we will pay back into this. And the nice thing is it's all an open exchange, right? So you can actually see that you can sort of see that that companies are donating, and then you can see that organizations are benefiting from it. And then there have been various attempts at this, but this one is really, I think this one really caught my eye, and I know it's definitely I know Laravel made a big commitment based on this, and we'll see if this happens with others, and then we'll see how long it persists, right? And then the sovereign tech funds. So I actually was in a conference in Poland just a few weeks ago, speaking with a Baltic company, and they just said, "Hey, we actually have money from one of these funds, and we need to make an investment. And we know there's this conference coming up. How do we do this?" And so I've witnessed firsthand the flow of capital from the government into private enterprise, but directed in a way that it benefits open source ecosystems, right? So we actually can see some of these things working. They're not just great ideas. They are great ideas. They're just not just great ideas. There's actually things happening. And so these are all interesting developments. But I'm guessing, like Jordi, you've been around. Do we think this is going to? I think this is going to stick. For sure, it's going to evolve. But do we think this is going to stick?
That's always the question. I've seen this with many of these, like donation platforms like Thanks.dev, or you have
buy Dev a coffee.
Yeah, this kind of approach. There are many that exist. Many have been started. Maybe many are still around in various states of success.
And then of course, and I guess we shouldn't also shouldn't fail to mention that there are plenty of companies that just have actively and consistently donated to the tech on which they rely, right? That is WordPress has been doing that, and so many others. But it is in our collective interest that we continue to find ways of making sure that support is there, because there's so much benefit. Now, how much time do each of you spend actively developing these days, like writing code?
I'm an easy answer, like pretty much 0 right now.
Cool, my man.
So yeah, I transitioned from the more into the organizing all of this overall, instead of like actually doing a whole lot of it myself. I think the last time I really spent any significant amount of time in developing was with the Composer 2 release, and making sure that those like big refactoring performance improvements worked out. And I mean, I guess I still often work as like somebody to give feedback to Jordi about like ideas and like how things should work. And maybe you can describe this as a bit of a product management type role, but
sounds an awful lot like
at
it.
Best, yeah. But
so Jordi, what do you think of your boss?
Yeah, I mean, he's doing code reviews and stuff. It's good. It's just good to have someone, because we otherwise don't really have like regular like dev on the Composer project. It's mostly me, and then there's definitely some people that are around reviewing stuff and answering issues and so on. That helps a lot, but it's just like there's nobody really committed to this that I can go to, and like Nils also has the whole history and the project knowledge to help there. So it's hard to replace.
Yeah. No.
But for me, I'm almost 100% coding, I would say. I'm mostly just doing the open source stuff, and kind of managed to ignore the private packagist side, which enables me to really focus on the Reds, which is nice. But comes
I think that's also part of how this came to be, is that, I mean, we started private packages intentionally choosing not to go the route of spending significant amounts of time on fundraising and trying to get people to somehow give us money, but instead let's build a service that people have a reason to use, that's just got a benefit of its own that people want to pay for, and then out of that money we can finance running the open source project. And so we basically have a separate team now that works on private packages, and occasionally some of these people do help out on a project on Composer or packages.org. There's often things that kind of overlap, and so our team on private packages does help Jordi with individual projects, but it does end up in a situation where we have a team of people now working on the paid product, like the commercial part, which I also help oversee and organize, and that's where like I'm kind of now between all these things and just trying to make sure this all still runs smoothly, I guess.
Okay. Well, it seems like a fruitful division of labor, if nothing else. Now, maybe switching gears a little bit, do you, and this might be too far down, I don't know, but do either of you see companies or teams, are there ways that are there common issues that businesses that are using your services, the common mistakes that they're making, or just wrong ways of thinking that you kind of wish everyone would sort of just understand from the beginning? Or is everything just set up and it just tends to work?
Maybe just one thing, and then I am sure Nils has way more details on that. But
he's a product guy.
Just one is like you said, like making their own mistakes with starting the restaurant. It's probably the main mistake I see is people deciding to keep using their stuff, or like to build their own solution instead of just trying private packages. Because they're like, oh, it's easy enough, I'll do it myself. And then they're like, yeah, maybe, it's one of these things, or maybe if we have like 5 people working on it full time, maybe it's a bit more complex than you think.
That's a very good point. I think that generally, I think people, or one thing I find interesting that we notice with private packages is that developers that work as employees at tech companies are exceptionally bad at valuing their own time on behalf of their employer. So if considering that when you as a developer working as an employee somewhere, if you decide to spend a few weeks of your time on something, how much money that is actually costing your employer is something that hardly any developer ever actively thinks about or reasons about. And so when you have tools being sold, or interesting to developers, right? And so in the end, there's like somebody else who makes the decision necessarily, but you still typically end up having a developer champion that product within the company. Then developers make these initial financial assumptions about like, ooh, might it be worth spending this much money on this product? And developers are very bad at comparing their own time's value to like the cost of an external product. I think that's where this goes a bit.
I mean, that's the, basically not created here. Therefore, I'm going to build exactly what I need mentality. Is that
but I think it's also
I
think the mentality is a bit this like my time is free, right? I'm already working here. I can just spend time on this. It doesn't cost the company any money. And I think that's also a bit of a failure from the business side of that company, because if you don't communicate to your developers that like your time should actually be spent on things that produce value for the company. And I think that sometimes lacks too, where the incentives are set wrong, where I can easily, as a developer, decide to spend a month working on a project. That's just my own decision. I maybe sort of need to clear this with my manager. But if I want to spend $100 a month, I need to go through like 5 different forms in different departments. So maybe you're kind of incentivizing things incorrectly and you're wasting resources if, as a company, that is how you tell developers how to spend their money.
We see what that's the I think an analog of this is that exactly like if I want to use a tool, I've got to go through procurement process, and even if it's $20 a month, but I can call a meeting with 5 department heads.
Exactly. Same thing.
And at any turn, I mean, I don't want to, I'm getting dangerously close to talking about human resources, but I mean, our time is a resource. And if the team is not thinking in terms of what is the cost per hour of the decisions that I make or don't make, and then the multiplier when I involve other people in those decisions. Yeah, that is a failure. That is a massive failure of management to set the right way of thinking, right? Because again, it all comes down to how are we taking our time and converting that into value. Ideally, value that exceeds the costs of the time that we're putting in to the company.
To go back to your question before, from like kind of like what do we think like common mistakes people make, and I think like another theme, just like thinking more of Composer and how people use Composer, and through private packages, I think we get to see a lot of individual workflows that companies have set up. And I think a common theme is that maybe instead of deciding that you know exactly what workflow will be best for you, you should maybe actually review how other people are working with that particular tool and be a little more flexible and open to maybe adjusting your workflows a bit to things recommended by that tool or what you do with that tool. Because often a small bit of adjustment on your side can lead to huge gains and avoiding lots of headaches down the line. And that's something that there's lots of different variations of this, but basically, if your workflows just keep creating issues where you keep having to make special requests about how can I do this thing with Composer, like that's not supported, or how can I support this particular situation here, then maybe you should consider if the workflow itself is the problem and not the tool that you're using.
Yeah.
I think that's something we run into quite a lot with private packages, where we really have to explain to people before switching to private packages how to improve their internal workflows first, so that they then have an easy time using the product.
Yeah, because they can't just spend their way out of that problem. Say, oh well, whether they know it or not, our internal, our code management workflows are absolute bollocks or have never even really been thought through. Let's just spend money with private packages and those problems go away. That is also a good point that I wanted to bring up anyway, which is that another cool effect of building a product like this that solves a real pain point is that I assume you do get some great insight into just the general how companies use the tool and what seems to work for them and what doesn't. Do you provide this feedback in like progressively, or not progressively, but sort of, do you expose some of these practices and these learnings? Are these things that people can find in a knowledge base, or is it more consultative? Do you just say, like, let people sort of say, hey, we're having a hard time doing this, or you notice they're not using the service and you reach out?
Yeah, I think currently is more the consultative version where we just talk to people like either during onboarding and you kind of try to figure out, okay, how exactly are you using Composer right now? And then you try and understand this better. But I think I've thought often enough about like maybe, formulating this out a bit more. There's definitely various resources across the web that have guides and that document
Yep.
how certain people set up their build processes for PHP projects. And so on one side, I feel like there's a wealth of resources if you want to figure out how to do this already. So I think I never quite felt the need to really contribute to that a lot. But at the same time, I think based on what I was just seeing about how we frequently run into people still not following any of these best practices, like maybe that's an indicator we should maybe do that a bit better and like actually write this out for people in a more complete guide. And so yeah,
And,
I think
and then
something we should look at.
And then I guess, Jordi, for you, you're actually, solving the world's problems directly with magical fingers typing on keyboard. I feel like we really need a beer for this discussion. It's do you? I mean, are you able to take these kind of feedback and these experiences and use it to either fine tune the current release or to sort of plan for what you want in the next release? Does it tie together that directly, or do you just generally have a good intuition about these things and you just kind of go for it?
There's a little bit of cross-pollination there, but maybe not that much. But I'm also exposed to lots of Composer users. Just, I also get lots of support requests and so on, which are the free ones, not the paid ones. But
yeah, the cheaper the customer, the bigger the problem usually.
Right. So
I think it's maybe a bit that often enough, like for example, if we do actually plan on adding a new feature to Composer, then in terms of thinking, okay, what options should this have? We can typically rely on, okay, we've previously seen when companies use this internally with private packages, typically they have a need to also configure these 2-3 other things. So like if we're adding this new feature, we should probably remember to include that this time as well.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of feedback often helps with just when we're thinking about, okay, we want to build a new feature, we're going to add something, like we got to keep in mind that that's typical workflows that people have. So I think that's definitely helped inform how to build those types of things out.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's envious. I mean, I know, look at Shopware, where a large chunk of our user base is self-hosted. We see and believe that as time goes on, even in the open source world, I think developers are less and less interested in directly. They kind of want these problems at the edge of whether you call it DevOps or infrastructure management or even deployment processes. Those things are, I think, over time going to be solved more and more, just handled by existing services. And we are in some ways happy for this future because it means that if we can get people onto our infrastructure, if we believe that we can solve these problems best because we know our domain pretty well, then we start to get a lot more hands-on insight. So what you all have is really an kind of an enviable position to both get the 10,000 foot view of how businesses use your service, and then and individual users use your services, and then drill down into the individual accounts and figure out what works and what doesn't. So
I think that's partially true. Like the problem
Okay.
we still have is, I mean, in the end, Composer is a CLI tool that runs on like a developer's machine at one of our customers. Yeah. And so while we do get some insight into, I mean, one for one, when we actually actively talk to customers, but I mean, you can do that with a self-hosted thing, and then some people just don't talk to you, and like, that's kind of how SaaS works.
Yep.
And you see kind of, sure, like our servers, what kind of requests do we get? But to actually get insight into how do they set up their CI workflows? How do they set up their deployment pipeline? And which parts of that does Composer do and how? And under, like, what is their typical workflow for, like, how frequently do I update my dependencies? And what commands do I use to update my dependencies? That stuff we don't easily see. And that's something I actually regularly, like when I go to conferences, like I tell people like that, like just tell me about it. I'm curious. Like, how often do you run a composer update command? Do you use like any arguments? Do you just run composer update? Like, I have no idea, and I'd love to understand this better. And like that's something we have very little insight about. And so in that sense, I mean, anybody listening to this too, like we love just hearing about kind of how do you do this, and like what types of problems do you typically run into or not, because it's very difficult to actually get information about that.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and you guys both spend time at conferences. I mean, that is time with your people. And I think you're both still doing presentations, right? You're both still speaking on occasion, maybe not as much as you
absolutely.
were.
Yeah, less and less.
Yeah, well, you get a little older, and you kind of do that family thing, and
yeah, exactly.
And Nils is waging like a one-man war against people abusing bicycling infrastructure in Berlin. Always a nice diversion. Okay, what else? So we're kind of closing on 40 minutes. This has been a great time together so far. Any big plans for 2025?
I think there's a few. You want to talk about those yet?
No obligation.
I'm not sure.
I don't need scoops.
Yeah, I think let's maybe not get into too much detail and overpromise things we may or may not be able to deliver. But I think something we want to do in 2025 a bit more is, like I mentioned, a few of these things where we talk quickly about government funding for projects. And there's also some private industry funds that try to improve security in open source infrastructure. Like one of these organizations, Alpha Omega at the Linux Foundation. It's basically Google, Microsoft, Amazon fund some money together to improve open source software. They already paid for a security audit for Composer and Packagist.org earlier this year. And I think we're going to look at a few of those different options for funding and look into some more major changes to things related to security and supply chain security in Composer, and see if some of the projects that we've been thinking about for several years might be able to implement those in 2025. We just get some extra funding and get a bit more paid help. So I think that's definitely going to be interesting next year to see what comes out of that.
All right. Am I going to see either of you at SymphonyCon in Vienna in December?
Yes,
both of us.
Outstanding. Well, we'll catch up on that tasty beverage proposition. I want to thank both of you for taking some time away. Speaking of the expense of calling a meeting, I don't know what you guys make, but I probably can't pay you. So consider this like the media analog of an open source get together. I do appreciate your time, and probably on behalf of a lot of people, thank you for all of the organization and enablement that you and your teams have delivered for probably hundreds of thousands of people the world over, rock stars in your own right. So, gentlemen, I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.